The door to the Guthrie Land Office swung open so hard it rattled the glass in its frame, and every man in that long, sweating line turned to look at the woman who had just walked in like she owned the territory already. Her name was Gertrude Doyle, and she was 26 years old, dark-haired and sun-browned, with calloused hands wrapped tight around a leather satchel that held everything she had left in this world: a deed survey, a hand-drawn map, $40 in paper money, and a folded letter from her late father that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. She wore a plain gray dress with a collar that had been mended twice at the throat, and her boots were good boots, the kind a working woman chose for durability rather than fashion. She had ridden 11 miles from the claim she intended to file on, and the red dust of the Oklahoma Territory was still clinging to her hem. It was April of 1889, the week after the great land run that had cracked the prairie open like a thunderclap and poured 50,000 souls across the starting line in a single wild afternoon. Guthrie had gone from a whistle stop to a tent city overnight, and the land office on Harrison Avenue was the single most chaotic place in the entire United States of America. The line stretched out the door and halfway down the block. Men with sunburned necks and desperate eyes. Men with lawyers beside them and documents folded neatly in leather cases. Men who had staked their claims with iron stakes and their names carved into cottonwood branches, and now needed the government's ink to make it real. Gertrude stepped into that line and did not flinch. She had ridden in the run herself, side saddle on a bay mare named Agnes, who had proven faster than half the horses on the starting line. She had found the quarter section her father had dreamed about: 160 acres along a creek bend with a stand of blackjack oak and enough flat ground to build something worth building. She had hammered her stake before sundown on the day of the run with her own hands, with a borrowed hammer, kneeling in the red Oklahoma dirt and whispering a promise to a man who would never see what she was about to do with his dream. Her father, Combe Doyle, had died the previous October. Pneumonia. He had spent 12 years saving to make this run, reading every pamphlet the government published about the unassigned lands, writing letters to the land office in Washington, drawing maps on the backs of envelopes at the kitchen table in their cramped Missouri apartment. He had wanted to give his daughter a place where she could be her own, a place that would belong to no husband, no landlord, no bank, just Gertrude, and whatever future she was brave enough to build on it. She was going to build it. She was going to do it alone if she had to. The line moved slowly. The morning got hotter. Outside, a man was arguing with a surveyor on the steps, something about boundary markers and a neighbor's fence post, and their voices carried through the open doorway in waves of frustration. Gertrude stood straight and kept her satchel against her chest, and mentally rehearsed what she would say when she reached the clerk's window. She had almost made it to the front when the trouble started. There were 2 men sitting on a bench along the left wall, big men, with the look of money and meanness about them. The older one wore a black coat even in the April heat, and his hat was expensive, and he had a gold watch chain that caught the light every time he shifted. The younger one was broad-shouldered and red-faced, and he had been watching Gertrude since she walked in with an expression that she recognized and despised. It was the look of a man who was calculating whether he could turn her vulnerability into his advantage. The older one, whose name she did not yet know, stood up when she was 3 people from the window. He walked to the clerk's counter with the air of a man who had never waited for anything in his life, and he laid a document on the counter with a decisive thump. "I need to register a claim on Section 14, Township 13, Range 2 West," he said to the clerk. "Homer Blatch. You'll find my paperwork already filed with your office last week." The clerk, a thin young man named Gerald who had the look of someone who had not slept since the run, glanced at Gertrude and then back at Blatch. "Sir, there's a line," Gerald said, without much conviction. "I'm aware of the line," Homer Blatch said pleasantly. "I'm also aware that I have business partners who have arrangements with this office, and I'd prefer not to make things complicated for anyone." Gertrude felt the blood rise in her face. She stepped forward. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice even, "that is the section I have come to file on. I staked that claim on April 22nd before sundown. I have a witness statement and a survey." Blatch turned to look at her with the slow, patient confidence of a man who has never had a woman disagree with him and won. "Is that right?" he said. It was not a question. "It is," she said, "and I intend to present my documents to this clerk in the order in which I arrived, which was before you." Blatch's red-faced companion stood up from the bench. "Little lady," Blatch said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "you've clearly had a hard ride, and I admire your spirit, I truly do. But a woman alone trying to homestead 160 acres is going to face hardships that have nothing to do with whether the government writes her name in a book. Why don't you let me purchase your interest in this claim and save yourself a great deal of difficulty?" The room had gone quiet in that particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone is listening but pretending they are not. Gertrude opened her mouth to answer. She said she was in line first. The voice came from behind her, low, calm, and carrying the particular quality of someone who had decided something and was done reconsidering it. She turned. The man standing directly behind her was perhaps 29 or 30, with dark red hair that had gone copper at the temples from the sun, and green eyes the color of creek water in shade. He was lean but broad through the shoulders, dressed in a working man's canvas shirt and suspenders, with trail dust on his hat and boots that had seen real miles. He was not wearing a gun in the office, sensible, given the rules posted on the door, but the way he stood suggested that the absence of one was a choice rather than a habit. His name was Patrick Redmond, though Gertrude did not know that yet. He was looking at Homer Blatch with an expression of absolute, untroubled directness, and he said it again. "She was in line before you. She's got documents. She'll file first." Blatch assessed him the way a man assesses a fence post briefly, and with the question of whether it's worth the trouble of going around it. "This doesn't concern you, friend." "I'll back that," Patrick said simply, meaning the claim, meaning her right to stand at that window, meaning all of it. "Whatever she needs, I'll back it." It was 3 words that changed everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Blatch held the assessment for another moment, then looked around the room at the faces of the other men in line, most of whom were now watching with the careful attention of people who have picked a side quietly. He picked up his document from the counter and stepped back. "We'll settle this through the proper channels," he said, with a pleasantness that was made entirely of threat. He went back to his bench. Gerald, the clerk, who had been holding his breath behind the counter, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you're at the window." Gertrude turned back to the counter. Her hands were trembling, but only slightly, and she pressed them flat against the leather of her satchel until they steadied. She laid out her documents one at a time: the survey, the witness affidavit from a farmer named Caleb Hauser who had seen her stake the claim, the map she had drawn herself, and the $40 in filing fees. Gerald examined each one with careful attention. He asked 2 questions, the exact coordinates of the northeast corner marker and the name of the creek. She answered both without hesitation. He stamped the document with the Land Office seal, wrote her name in the registration ledger in ink that would last 100 years, and handed her the receipt. "Congratulations, Miss Doyle," Gerald said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Your claim is filed." She slid the receipt into her satchel and fastened the clasp. Her eyes were burning, but she was not going to cry in this office, not in front of Homer Blatch and his red-faced companion, not in front of any of them. She turned from the window. Patrick Redmond was still standing exactly where she had left him, and he gave her a slight nod, the kind that carries respect without any condescension in it. "Thank you," she said quietly, and she meant it down to the bone. "Good luck with it," he said. She walked out into the April sunshine. She did not see him again for 3 days. Those 3 days were the hardest of her life since her father had died. She rode back to her claim the morning after the filing, with her receipt tucked into the inner pocket of her coat, and stood in the middle of her 160 acres, and had the first moment of complete silence she had experienced in months. The prairie stretched around her in every direction, yellow-green with spring grass, and the creek curved through the lower quarter of her land with a sound like something whispering the word yes. The blackjack oaks were budding. There was a small rise to the north that would be a perfect building site, high enough to catch the breeze and low enough to be sheltered from the wind. She had a tent, a bedroll, a cast iron skillet, a box of provisions, a shovel, an axe, and Agnes. She set to work. She spent the first day cutting stakes and marking the boundaries of where her house would stand. She spent the second day attempting to begin digging a well, which went poorly because she hit rock at 4 feet down and had to shift her location. She spent the second night lying in her tent listening to the coyotes calling across the dark and thinking about everything that had to happen: the well, the house, the garden, the breaking of sod, the fencing, the planting, and the fact that she had $32 left after the filing fees and no neighbor closer than 1.5 miles in any direction. On the morning of the third day, she heard hoofbeats. She was at the creek filling her water bucket when the rider came over the north rise, and she straightened immediately, because out here, in the rawness of a land that had just been claimed by thousands of strangers, you did not know yet who your neighbors would be or what they would want. She kept the bucket in one hand and put the other hand on the handle of the small knife at her belt, not drawing it, just knowing where it was. The horse was a good one, a dark gray gelding with a white blaze, moving at an easy walk. The rider pulled up about 20 feet from the creek bank and took his hat off. It was Patrick Redmond. Up close in the full morning light rather than the dim interior of the land office, she had time to actually see him. The copper-red hair, the green eyes that had something genuinely kind in them, not performed kindness but the real article, the jaw that had 2 days of stubble on it, the way he held himself on a horse, easy and practiced, like someone who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback without needing to think about it. "Miss Doyle," he said. She stared at him. "How do you know my name?" "Gerald at the land office mentioned it," he said. "I hope that's not too alarming. I'm Patrick Redmond. I filed the quarter section directly north of yours." She processed this. "You're my neighbor." "It appears so," he said. "I came to introduce myself properly. And also," he reached back into the saddlebag and produced a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "My mother packed enough food for an army when I left Missouri, and I've been eating from it for a week, so I thought you might want some of it." She looked at the bundle. She looked at him. She had not eaten anything in the last 24 hours except dried biscuit and creek water because she had miscalculated her provisions and was trying to make them stretch. "I don't take charity," she said. "I know," he said. "It's not charity. I'm going to need to borrow your shovel next week because mine cracked on a stone and I haven't replaced it yet. Consider it a trade." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face for the particular kind of dishonesty that presents itself as generosity, and she did not find it. She put the bucket down and walked across the creek bank and took the bundle. "Thank you," she said. "Can I ask how the well is going?" he said. She showed him. He climbed off the gray gelding, whose name, she would later learn, was Drummer, and crouched at the edge of the pit and looked at the rock ledge she had struck. "You want to go about 8 feet to the west," he said. The topography of this bend usually means the water table follows the creek curve. If you go at an angle westward, you'll hit water before you hit more rock. She crossed her arms. "How do you know that?" "My father was a well digger in Ohio before he moved us to Missouri," Patrick said. "I dug my first well when I was 14. I'm not guessing." She uncrossed her arms. "All right," she said. He dug with her for 3 hours that morning, trading the shovel back and forth. She had been right that there was only one shovel, and she would not have accepted his help if she had nothing to offer in return. And at 7 feet, 2 inches, 8 feet to the west of her original pit, they hit water. Clean, cold water that pooled up through the sandy subsoil and caught the light. Gertrude sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long, silent moment. 7 feet and 2 inches, she said. "Not bad." "Not bad at all," Patrick agreed. He left before noon because he had his own work to get back to. She watched him ride north over the rise on Drummer, and then she went back to work, and for the first time since she had staked this claim, she felt something that was not just determination. She felt something lighter than that. She wasn't sure yet what to call it. Over the next 2 weeks, the Doyle claim and the Redmond claim became the two most industrious plots of land on that stretch of Oklahoma prairie. Gertrude broke her first acre of sod with a rented breaking plow and a borrowed mule, which took 3 days of grinding, blistering work that left her hands bleeding through her gloves. She planted kitchen garden seeds, beans, squash, onions, potatoes, in the strip of soil alongside the creek where the earth was already loose. She gathered stones from the creek bed and began laying the foundation of what would eventually be a house, working from a plan she had sketched in the back of her notebook, which was the smallest practical structure she could imagine: 1 room, with a sleeping loft, and a door that faced east to catch the morning light. Patrick Redmond, to the north, was breaking sod too, and building a rough timber frame structure that was larger and more ambitious than Gertrude's plan, because he had come to Oklahoma with a specific vision. He intended to run cattle. Not many. He did not have the capital for a large herd, but enough to build from. He had arranged for 20 head of longhorn cattle to be driven up from Texas by the end of May, and in the meantime he was fencing his eastern boundary and building a corral. They fell into a rhythm without planning it. On Tuesday mornings, Patrick would ride south on Drummer and help Gertrude with whatever required 2 people lifting the heavier foundation stones, bracing the roof beams of the house frame she was building, repairing a section of Agnes's paddock fence that had blown over in a night wind. On Thursday afternoons, Gertrude would ride north on Agnes and help Patrick with the fencing, because fencing is the kind of work that goes twice as fast with 2 people and takes forever alone. They talked while they worked. Gertrude discovered that Patrick had grown up on a farm outside of St. Louis, the second of 4 children, and had worked every kind of job that needed doing in rural Missouri: farmhand, well digger, timber cutter, livery assistant, before he had scraped together enough to make the run. His older brother Thomas was running the family farm, and his 2 younger sisters were both married and settled, and he was the odd one out, the one who had spent 10 years being quietly restless, waiting for something that finally arrived in the shape of the Oklahoma land run. "What are you going to do with 160 acres and 20 longhorns?" Gertrude asked him one Thursday, driving a fence post while he held the post straight. "Increase the herd," he said. "Lease grazing rights from the Cherokee Strip if it opens. Build a proper barn by fall. In 5 years I want 200 head and enough hay ground to winter them without buying feed." He paused. "What about you? What are you building?" She drove another 2 inches of post into the ground before she answered. "My father wanted this land," she said. "He read about it for 12 years. He never got to see it." She stopped, drove the post again. "I'm going to make it worth what he never got to have. A real farm. Corn and wheat once I've broken enough ground. Maybe a kitchen garden big enough to sell from. I can put vegetables on the train to Kansas City if I grow enough." "That's a good plan," Patrick said, and he said it like he had actually considered it and found it sound, not like he was being polite. She found she appreciated that enormously. She had talked about her plans with other people in the weeks after her father died: her aunt in Missouri City, a neighbor's husband, the man at the bank where she had her small account, and every one of them had told her some version of the same thing, which was that it was a lot to take on alone, and perhaps she ought to reconsider, and was there not a sensible man somewhere who would benefit from her companionship and her father's savings? Not a single one of them had looked at her plans and said, "That's a good plan." Patrick Redmond said it as if the capacity to execute it was something he had already concluded she possessed. In the evenings, when the work was done and the sky went purple and gold over the prairie, they would sometimes sit outside one or the other of their half-built structures with a tin cup of coffee and watch the dark come in from the east. They talked about Missouri and Ohio, about their fathers, and the way men of that generation had worked themselves into the ground for the sake of something they hoped to pass on. They talked about the strangeness of Guthrie, which was turning from a tent city into something with actual streets and storefronts at a speed that was almost frightening. They talked about the weather, the soil, the quality of the creek water, the behavior of the coyotes at night, the way the prairie looked on a clear morning when the dew was still on the grass, and the light was coming in sideways and everything was gold. Gertrude noticed, with the detached precision of a woman who had spent most of her adult life taking care of herself, that she was looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays. She also noticed that Patrick Redmond never said anything that required her to defend herself. He never expressed surprise when she knew something he didn't expect her to know. He never talked about her plan as if it required his approval or his presence to succeed. He helped her because she would have helped him, and because the help was needed, and for no other reason that she could identify, which meant that she had to remain cautious. Because in her experience, men who appeared to have no agenda were the most dangerous kind, because eventually the agenda revealed itself, and by then you were too attached to be sensible about it. She was fairly attached by the 3rd week of May, when the trouble with Homer Blatch came back. She came home from Guthrie on a Wednesday afternoon. She had ridden in to buy seed corn and a window frame from the new hardware store that had opened on Division Street, and found that her boundary stakes on the southern edge of her claim had been pulled up. All 6 of them. The iron rods she had hammered into the ground herself were lying in the grass, tossed aside as carelessly as matchsticks. She stood at the edge of her land and looked at those iron rods lying in the grass, and felt a cold, hard anger settle in her chest like a stone going to the bottom of a creek. She went back to her tent, put away the seed corn, and the next morning rode to Guthrie to see the county recorder and find out who held the claim directly south of hers. The answer was Homer Blatch. She sat in the county recorder's small, hot office and read the filing documentation with the careful attention of someone who has learned that the details are where the danger lives. Blatch had filed his claim on April 26th, 4 days after the run. His claim on Section 14 was legitimate. The boundary question she had interrupted in the land office had apparently been resolved in her favor, but Blatch had Section 15, which ran along her southern border. Technically, the pulled stakes were his way of saying that he disputed where that border was drawn. She went to see Gerald at the land office. Gerald confirmed that boundary disputes had to go before the Territorial Land Court, which met on the 2nd Friday of each month, and the next session was 17 days away. She went back to her claim, replaced her stakes, and built a small cairn of stones at each corner so that if the stakes were pulled again, the physical evidence of the boundary would remain. 2 days later, she rode north to the Redmond claim to return the shovel she had borrowed and to repay the previous week's work with 2 jars of pickled vegetables. She had put up from the first of her kitchen garden produce, radishes and green onions that had come in faster than she'd expected, preserved in vinegar with a handful of dill from the bunch she'd brought from Missouri. She found Patrick in the corral with 3 men she did not recognize, and a small herd of cattle that had clearly just arrived, because the animals had the look of a long journey about them, thin, dusty, and unhappy. He saw her ride up and excused himself from the other men. "Your cattle," she said. 23 head, he said, with a quiet pleasure that she found unexpectedly appealing. Driver brought 3 extras that his client couldn't pay for. I traded 2 days' work for them. He looked genuinely happy in the uncomplicated way of a person looking at something they have worked hard toward and can now see in front of them. She told him about Blatch and the stakes. His face changed. "When did this happen?" "Wednesday afternoon," she said. "I was in Guthrie." "Have you got witnesses to where the stakes were?" "I have the original survey," she said, "and Gerald at the land office has a copy." "Good," he said. "You'll need that for the territorial court. Have you filed a complaint?" "Not yet," she said. "I was going to do it tomorrow." "I'll ride in with you," he said. She looked at him. She wanted to say she didn't need him to. The words sat on her tongue, ready and familiar, because she had been saying them in one form or another for most of her adult life. But the truth was that she did not know the territorial court process, and she suspected that a woman filing a complaint against a man like Homer Blatch was going to need every piece of documentation and every credible witness she could assemble. And Patrick Redmond, who had watched Blatch retreat in the land office and clearly understood that the man was the kind who pressed where he found weakness, was not the wrong person to have beside her. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They rode into Guthrie the next morning at 7 o'clock, before the heat settled. The town was loud with the sounds of construction hammers and saws, and the creak of loaded wagons, and the smell of fresh lumber mixed with the ever-present red dust. Patrick tied Drummer to the hitching post outside the land office and held Agnes's reins while Gertrude climbed down, and she caught herself noticing the straightforward courtesy of the gesture, and immediately catalogued the noticing and set it aside for later consideration. Gerald helped them file the boundary complaint with the territorial court recorder's office next door. The recorder, a heavyset man named Obadiah Fenwick who smelled strongly of pipe tobacco, took the survey documents and made careful copies, and assigned the complaint a case number, and told Gertrude that her case would be heard on the second Friday of June. "What's the nature of the opposing party's claim?" Fenwick asked. "Homer Blatch says the southern border of my claim is 40 feet north of where I have it marked," Gertrude said. "That would put approximately 8 acres of my land inside his filing." Fenwick wrote something in his ledger. "Do you have the original witness affidavit from your filing?" She laid it on his desk. He copied it. He also wrote Patrick Redmond's name as a character witness at Patrick's quiet suggestion, which Fenwick accepted without comment. They came out of the recorder's office into the bright morning. Gertrude took a breath of the warm, dusty Guthrie air. "Do you think it'll hold?" she asked. Not meaning the claim, she knew the claim was solid. She meant the court. She meant the process. She meant the question underneath everything, which was, does the law actually work for someone like me? Patrick was quiet for a moment. He was not the kind of man who answered questions before he thought about them, which was, she had decided, one of the most underrated qualities a person could possess. "I think the survey evidence is stronger than anything Blatch has," he said finally. "Gerald stamped your documents before Blatch said a word. The physical record is clear. Fenwick seems like a man who values documentation over persuasion." He paused. "That doesn't mean Blatch won't try other things." "I know," she said. "I'll keep a closer eye on your southern boundary until June," he said. She looked at him. The sun was behind him, and it made his copper hair catch fire. And she thought about how strange it was that 3 weeks ago she had not known this man existed. And now the shape of her days included him in a way that felt both entirely new and somehow already familiar. "You have a cattle operation to build," she said. "I do," he agreed. "It's not so far that I can't look south while I'm doing it." She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully arrived, but he saw the beginning of it, and something in his face changed, not dramatically, just a slight warmth, like a lamp turned up one notch. And then they both looked away in the same moment, at the street, at their horses, at the ordinary busy morning of Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory. They rode home mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the specific way that silences are comfortable between people who have already said enough things of substance to each other that silence doesn't feel like absence. June arrived with a heat that pressed down on the prairie like a hand. Gertrude's garden was coming in strong. The beans were climbing their poles. The squash were spreading their broad leaves over the dark soil. The corn she had planted was knee-high and reaching. She had broken another 2 acres of sod with the borrowed mule and planted winter wheat, which she would harvest the following summer. The house frame was up, and she had managed to get the roof on that had required Patrick's help and 2 extra pairs of hands, a pair belonging to a Norwegian homesteader named Eric Sorensen, who lived a mile to the east, and the other pair belonging to Sorensen's eldest son. a cheerful 17-year-old who kept staring at the horizon as if he expected something extraordinary to appear on it. The roof was not beautiful, but it was solid, and when the first June rain came, it kept the inside dry, and Gertrude stood in the center of her single room and listened to the rain drum on the wooden shingles and felt something so large and complicated that she could not name all of it. But some of it was pride, and some of it was grief, and all of it was love for a dead man who had given her this chance. She wept, briefly and privately, and then she put the kettle on. The territorial court hearing was on June 14th, a Friday. She arrived in Guthrie with Patrick, and with the full folder of documentation she had assembled over the preceding weeks. The original survey, the filing receipt, the witness affidavit from Caleb Hauser, a written statement from Gerald at the land office, and a handwritten statement from Patrick attesting to the location of the boundary markers as he had observed them on his first visit to her claim in April. The courtroom was a room above the hardware store on Harrison Avenue that had been repurposed with rows of chairs and a wooden bench at the front for the judge. It smelled of sawdust and varnish. The judge was a compact man named Elias Carr, who had come west from Indiana and had the look of someone who had seen every kind of argument that human desperation could produce and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. Homer Blatch was there with a lawyer, an actual lawyer, expensively dressed, with a document case and the confident air of a man who charges by the hour and knows it. Blatch himself wore his black coat again, and he nodded at Gertrude when she came in with the particular pleasantness that was entirely made of threat, and she nodded back with the particular directness that was entirely made of resolve. The hearing took most of the morning. Blatch's lawyer made an argument about the imprecision of the original survey, suggesting that the surveyor had made a 40-foot error in the eastern line. The surveyor, when Fenwick had him brought in to testify, pushed back firmly. The survey had been conducted by proper triangulation using established landmarks, and the error the lawyer was suggesting was not geometrically possible given the reference points used. Gertrude presented her documents. Patrick testified. Gerald testified by written statement because he could not leave the land office during business hours. Judge Carr asked one question of Blatch's lawyer. "Do you have a competing survey?" The lawyer did not. "Then you have an argument," Carr said, "not evidence. I'll rule for the existing documentation." He looked at Gertrude. "Your boundary stands as filed, Miss Doyle. Mr. Blatch is ordered to replace any markers that have been disturbed on your southern line and to refrain from any further interference with your claim. If I see this matter again, Mr. Blatch, the cost of that will be considerably higher than the filing of a new complaint." He banged his gavel. Gertrude sat in her chair for a moment after the room began to empty, holding her document folder in both hands, listening to the sounds of the Guthrie morning coming through the window, the hammers and the wagon wheels and the voices of 1,000 people building something in the red Oklahoma dust, and she thought, "I did that. My father's land, my name in the book, my boundary standing where I hammered it." Patrick was sitting beside her and he said nothing, because he understood that this was a moment that belonged entirely to her. After a while she looked at him. "I'm going to buy us the best dinner that Guthrie has to offer," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What does Guthrie have to offer?" "I saw a place on Oklahoma Avenue last week that claimed to serve beefsteak," she said. "Then we should absolutely verify that claim," he said. They had beefsteak at a rough-planked restaurant where the tables were barrels and the chairs were stumps, and the beefsteak was exactly as good as the frontier version of good could be, which meant it was tough, but it was real, and it was hot, and it was served with bread that was still warm from the oven, and a pot of coffee so strong it could have stood a spoon upright. They ate and talked for 2 hours, and somewhere during those 2 hours something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a season shifts, which is gradually and then unmistakably. They talked about their families and their childhoods and the exact quality of Missouri autumns, and Patrick told her about the night he had decided to make the run, sitting on a fence post in a muddy field and reading the government pamphlet by lantern light, and feeling something in his chest crack open like a door. And Gertrude told him about the night her father died, and how she had sat by his bed for an hour after, holding his hand, and had finally said to him in the quiet, "I'll go. I'll do it. You just rest." Patrick listened to that without flinching or looking away, which was the right thing to do, and the thing that most people found too difficult. "He would have liked you," she said. "How do you know?" he said. "Because you say useful things and you mean them," she said. He had no patience for any other kind. Patrick looked at her across the barrel table in the rough Guthrie restaurant with the sounds of the territory coming through the walls on all sides, and he said quietly, "I think you might be the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life so far." She held very still. "That's a considerable statement," she said. "I don't make them lightly," he said. She looked at him for a long time, at the green eyes that were honest and direct, at the face that was not conventionally handsome, but was the kind of face that got better the more you looked at it, at the man who had stood in a line and said, "I'll back that," with no more calculation than a person calculating whether 2 plus 2 is 4. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I should tell you that directly, since you seem to prefer directness." "I haven't found that to be the case," he said. "I'm stubborn," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't ask for help easily. I know that too. And I will not give up this land for anything," she said. "Not for comfort, not for convenience, not for," she paused, "not for any arrangement that requires me to put it second." He looked at her with that quiet steadiness that was, she had come to understand, simply the way he was. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to." She breathed in. She breathed out. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was something more practical than that and more real. Summer on the Oklahoma prairie had a quality unlike anything either of them had experienced in Missouri or Ohio. A vast, burning brightness that pressed down from noon until 4 in the afternoon, and turned the grass gold, and made the air above the land shimmer with heat that was almost visible. The creek shrank in July, retreating to a narrow thread between its banks, but the well held steady, cold and clean, and Gertrude's kitchen garden survived because she carried water to it in the early mornings and late evenings, 2 buckets at a time, in the particular mindless persistence that is the most important quality a homesteader can possess. Patrick's cattle settled into the land. He bought 5 more head in July from a drive that passed through on its way to Caldwell, bringing his herd to 28. And he hired a Chickasaw man named James Running Fox as a part-time hand to help manage them, paying him in cash and meals, which was a straightforward and fair arrangement that Eric Sorensen, the Norwegian homesteader to the east, found remarkable, and said so directly to Patrick one afternoon when they were mending a shared fence line. "Most men wouldn't," Sorensen said, meaning the fairness of it. "Most men aren't thinking clearly," Patrick said, and hammered in his staple. Gertrude rode north most evenings now, not to work. They both had more work than hours in the day, but simply because the distance between the 2 claims had begun to feel like something she was aware of in her body, a kind of mild, constant ache of absence, which was a thing she had never experienced before, and which she examined with the same practical honesty she applied to everything. She was in love with Patrick Redmond. She had arrived at this conclusion on a Tuesday in late July when she had been standing at her kitchen garden pulling weeds and had found herself, without any specific trigger, thinking about the exact sound of his laugh, which was not frequent but was genuine, a low and slightly surprised sound, as if he was pleased to have been caught off guard, and had stood up from the weeds and said, to no one but the beans and the squash and Agnes, who was grazing at the paddock fence, "Well, there it is." It was not a comfortable feeling. It was large and inconvenient, and it complicated the clean lines of a life she had drawn for herself with great deliberate care, a life in which she was the author and the executor and the sole beneficiary of all decisions. Being in love with a specific person introduced a variable that was not entirely under her control, which was, professionally speaking, a problem. She went to see him that evening anyway, because the alternative was to stay in her single-room house with just the inconvenient feeling for company, and that seemed worse. He was at the corral when she rode up, and he turned when he heard Agnes's hoofbeats. He had a coil of rope over one shoulder and the look of a man who had been working since before dawn, which was probably accurate because he almost always had been. He smiled when he saw her, not the slight warmth that she had catalogued before, but a full and open smile, the kind that his face did not get around to frequently, but, when it did, was absolutely unambiguous. She got off Agnes and tied her to the fence and walked up to him and said, without preamble, "I am in love with you and I think you should know that." He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Thank God," he said. She stared at him. "That's your response." "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you the same thing for approximately 6 weeks, he said. "And I was not making a lot of progress, so yes. Thank God you said it first." She laughed. It came out of her like something that had been looking for an exit, real and full and slightly astonished, and she put her hand over her mouth and then took it away because there was no reason to hide it. He took the coil of rope off his shoulder and set it on the fence post and took 2 steps toward her, and she took 1 step toward him, and they met in the middle with an embrace that was not tentative or performative but immediate and solid and real, the way 2 people embrace when they have both been waiting longer than they were willing to admit. He held her with both arms, and she pressed her face briefly into the side of his neck, and she felt the particular profound relief of being fully known by a person and not found wanting. "I should tell you," he said, into her hair, "that I have been cataloging reasons why I was right about you since approximately the first hour." "What reasons?" She said, "The way you said your boundary coordinates to Gerald without hesitating," he said. "The way you drove fence posts, the way you talked about your father, the way you looked at the water when it came up in the well." She pulled back far enough to look at him. His green eyes in the late evening light had gone dark and warm. "Patrick," she said, "I want this to be something real." "So do I," he said. "I mean real in the way that doesn't require me to become less than I am," she said. "Real in the way that 2 people build 2 things, and the 2 things are stronger for being side by side. Not the other kind. The other kind where one person is reduced to a fraction of themselves so the other person can feel complete," he said. "Yes," she said. "Gertrude," he said, with a patience that was entirely free of condescension, "I am standing on 160 acres that I worked for, and so are you. I would not trade either of those acres for the world, and I would not ask you to either." She held that for a moment. "All right," she said again, which was the same word she had used in the restaurant but with considerably more weight in it this time. "All right," he agreed. He kissed her then, in the dying light above the Oklahoma prairie, with his cattle moving quietly in the corral behind them and Drummer and Agnes companionably side by side at the fence. And it was the kind of first kiss that is both entirely sufficient in itself and a clear indication of everything that is going to follow. August was the fullest month either of them had ever lived. Patrick's cattle operation was taking shape. He had purchased a breeding bull from a rancher in the Cherokee Strip, which required a 2-day ride and a good deal of negotiation, and the herd dynamics shifted in the particular way that happens when a proper bull arrives, which is to say with considerable noise and drama before settling into something workable. James Running Fox had become a full-time hand, living in the small timber bunkhouse that Patrick built behind the main structure, and he had opinions about cattle management that were both informed and practical, and Patrick listened to them, and the operation was better for it. Gertrude had harvested the first of her kitchen garden produce, beans, by the basketful, squash of 3 varieties, a surprising abundance of onions, and had taken 2 wagon loads into Guthrie to sell at the public market on Oklahoma Avenue, which had been established in July and was already a twice-weekly institution. She had sold everything she brought both times, cleared $4.70 on the first trip and $6 on the second, and had used the money to buy glass jars and a canning kettle so she could put up the remainder for the winter. She was building something. She could see it taking shape around her, not as a fantasy but as a physical reality. The house with its east-facing door, the garden with its full rows, the well with its clean water, the paddock where Agnes grazed in the evenings, the wheat field that would not yield until next summer but was already there in the ground, patient and invisible, waiting. Patrick proposed to her on a September evening, sitting on the creek bank below her house, with the sky going red and orange behind the blackjack oaks and the sound of the creek running low and quiet between the stones. He did not make a speech. He said, "I want to marry you, Gertrude. I want to spend my life on land that borders yours. I want to know what you think about everything, for as long as you're willing to tell me. I want to build this with you." She sat beside him on the creek bank and looked at the red sky and thought about her father, who had wanted her to have something that was her own. She thought about what it meant to choose this particular man, who had never once suggested that her claim was negotiable, who had stood behind her in a line and said, "I'll back that," as naturally as breathing, who laughed rarely but genuinely and dug wells with practical expertise and listened without flinching. She thought about the way the land looked in the morning light, hers and his, running side by side across the Oklahoma plain. "Yes," she said, "but I keep my claim separate from yours in the record." He did not even pause. "Of course. And I keep my name in the registration ledger exactly as it is. Will be the Redmond Doyle operation," he said, "or the Doyle-Redmond operation. I don't mind which." "Redmond Doyle," she said, because it had a better sound and because she was who she was. "Redmond Doyle," he agreed. They were married in October 1889, 6 months after the land run, at a small ceremony in the newly built church in Guthrie, a plain white clapboard building that smelled of fresh wood and new paint. Eric Sorensen and his wife Ingrid came. James Running Fox came. Gerald from the land office came, which surprised Gertrude and pleased her enormously. A dozen other homesteaders from the surrounding claims attended, people Gertrude and Patrick had met over the summer in the accumulated ways of frontier community, the shared labor of barn raisings and harvest helps, and the lending of tools, and the exchange of seeds, and the trading of information about weather and market prices, and which vendors in Guthrie were honest, and which ones padded their measures. Gertrude wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico, because she could not afford anything impractical, and she wore her good boots, because the church floor was rough and she was a practical woman. She carried a small bunch of autumn wildflowers from her creek bank, asters and goldenrod, because there were no florists within 40 miles. She stood at the altar with Patrick Redmond, and said her vows with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him and meaning every word. And when he said his vows back to her, his voice was steady and his eyes were bright, and there was nothing in them but honesty and love, which were the two things she had always required of the world and rarely found together. The minister, who had arrived in the territory from Cincinnati with a Bible and considerable optimism, said a few words about the covenant of marriage and the building of lives in new places, and then he said, "I now pronounce you man and wife." And Patrick took her face in both hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made Ingrid Sorensen cry quietly into her handkerchief. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the church hall, potato stew and cornbread, and a fiddle player from 2 claims over who knew 40 songs, and played them all with cheerful competence. People danced on the rough wooden floor, and even Gertrude danced, though she had not danced since before her father died, and she had not believed she remembered how, and it turned out she remembered perfectly well. Patrick danced with her for most of the evening, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him directly. "My mother insisted on it," he said. She said a man who couldn't dance was a man who didn't understand music, and a man who didn't understand music couldn't be trusted in any serious matter. "Your mother sounds like someone I would like," Gertrude said. "She would love you enormously," he said. "She would love everything about you. Particularly the part where you told Homer Blatch to get out of your way in the land office." "I didn't tell him that," Gertrude said. "You told him with your posture," Patrick said. "Same thing." She laughed again, and this time she didn't catch it at all, and he watched her laugh with an expression that she was beginning to understand was simply the face he made when he was completely, quietly happy. Their first winter in Oklahoma was hard. Not catastrophic, the house held, the well held, the food stores were sufficient, but hard in the way that first winters in new places are hard, which is that they reveal every weakness in what you have built and every miscalculation in what you planned. The wind came in December from the north and did not stop, a constant, grinding, horizontal wind that drove dust, and then sleet, and then eventually snow through every gap in every building. The cattle huddled in their corral and consumed hay at a rate that required Patrick to buy 3 additional loads from a supplier in Guthrie at a price that made him wince. Agnes refused to go outside for approximately 2 weeks in January, which was a personality decision that Gertrude respected, while also pointing out that Agnes was going to have to relocate her feelings about wind at some point. They spent the winter evenings in the house that had formerly been only Gertrude's house and was now both of theirs. They had expanded it in November, adding a second room and building a proper stone fireplace on the east wall, and the space was still small, but it was tight and warm, and it smelled of pine wood and coffee, and the dried herbs Gertrude had hung from the ceiling rafters. They read to each other from the small collection of books they had brought from Missouri, and the few they had acquired from the tiny Guthrie library that had been established in someone's front room in August. They played cards. They made plans. They made plans with the same practical intensity they had brought to every other aspect of their lives: maps on paper, numbers in columns, considerations and alternatives, and the weighing of one option against another. By February, they had a clear 3-year plan for the Redmond Doyle operation. Expand the cattle herd to 50 head by spring 1891, break an additional 10 acres on Gertrude's claim for corn planting in the summer of 1890, expand the kitchen garden market sales, build a proper barn by fall 1890, and investigate the grain elevator situation in Guthrie, because once the wheat came in from the winter planting, there would need to be somewhere to take it. They also, somewhere in those winter evenings, talked about the injustices of the territory in a way that felt necessary and honest. James Running Fox had told Patrick about the conditions of the Chickasaw Nation to the south, about the way the federal government had handled the land negotiations with the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, who had been promised their Indian territory as sovereign land, and were now watching the surrounding prairies fill with settlers and wondering how long that promise would hold. James did not say this with bitterness. He said it with the flat precision of someone describing weather, but it settled in Patrick's chest with a weight that he did not dismiss. "This land we're on," Gertrude said one evening, "was prairie that the government took from someone before they made it available to us." "Yes," Patrick said. "That's a thing that doesn't go away just because we didn't make the original decision," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a while, which was the right thing to do, and they made a point of being straightforwardly fair with James and with the other Chickasaw men who occasionally worked on the claim by day, which was not the solution to anything larger but was the thing they had the power to do. Spring came back to the Oklahoma Territory with the same drama. It always brought thunderstorms that rolled across the plains in towering black walls, rain that turned the red soil into mud that grabbed at boot heels and wagon wheels with equal enthusiasm. And then suddenly, almost overnight, the green return of everything, the grass and the trees and the garden coming back from the dead in the irrefutable way of things that know how to wait. Gertrude discovered in March of 1890 that she was going to have a child. She sat with this information for a full day before telling Patrick, not because she doubted what it meant, but because she needed to organize her thoughts around it. This new thing, this arriving person who was going to require a great deal from the world she was building. She thought about her father, who had not lived to see any of this. She thought about the house and the well and the wheat in the ground and the kitchen garden waiting to be replanted. And she thought about how none of those things changed because of this news, and how all of them were going to mean more. She told Patrick that evening. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and folded her hands on the wood and said, "You are going to be a father." He was absolutely still for the space of 3 seconds. Then he got up from his chair, came around the table, crouched beside her, took both her hands in both of his and said, with a quietness that held an entire ocean, "Are you all right?" "I'm well," she said. "I wanted you to know." He held her hands very carefully, as if she were made of something valuable, which she was not. She was made of the same iron-hard practicality she had always been made of, but she allowed the tenderness of it because it was not condescension. It was love, and those were very different things. "I'm going to be the kind of father who teaches our children to dig wells," he said. She laughed until her eyes watered. The summer of 1890 was the best summer either of them had lived. The wheat from the fall planting came in July, a pale gold wave across the south portion of Gertrude's claim, more than she had hoped and less than a bumper crop, but enough, decidedly enough. She and Patrick cut it together, with borrowed equipment from Sorensen and 2 hired men from Guthrie, and took it to the grain elevator on Division Street, and received a check that was the first real revenue from the Doyle portion of the Redmond Doyle operation. And Gertrude put it in the bank account she had held since Missouri, which now had her name and Patrick's name on it, but was governed by a separate agreement they had written up together with the help of a Guthrie attorney named Morris, who had found the arrangement unusual, but had drawn it up without complaint, because a client was a client. James Running Fox, who had been managing the cattle with increasing skill and independence, suggested that fall was the right time to add a bull of the Hereford breed to complement the Longhorn herd, arguing that crossbred cattle would produce better weight and temperament for a territory that was beginning to develop real market access. Patrick agreed. James sourced the Hereford bull from a rancher near Caldwell who was switching to pure Hereford stock and sold the old bull at a fair price. The Redmond Doyle cattle herd ended 1890 at 44 head. Gertrude's son was born in November of 1890, on a cold and clear evening when the stars over the Oklahoma territory were so thick and bright they looked like spilled salt on a black tablecloth. The birth was managed by Ingrid Sorensen, who had 3 children of her own and had midwifed 2 neighbors, and who came the moment she received Patrick's message, and stayed through the night with brisk competence and genuine warmth. It was a hard labor, 8 hours, and Gertrude was not a woman who complained about hard things, but by hour 6 she had Patrick's hand in a grip that he later said he could still feel in his fingers 3 days later, and she had told him quite clearly that she was fine. She was absolutely fine. There was no reason to look like that. "I'm not looking like anything," he said. "You look like a man standing at the edge of a very high cliff," she said, through gritted teeth. "That is an accurate description of how I feel," he said. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Ingrid said, "There we are, come now," and then there was a thin, indignant cry that rose into the cold air of the room and expanded to fill it entirely. Patrick's son, dark-haired like his mother, red-faced and furious at the indignity of birth, with hands no bigger than small flower buds, clenching and unclenching in the lamplight. "Comb," Gertrude said when they put him in her arms, after her father. She did not frame it as a question. Patrick looked at the baby and then at her, and his face was something she had never seen on it before, a complete and open wonder, unguarded, as if every defense had simply stepped aside for this one moment. "Comb," he said. "Yes, Comb Redmond. Born in a house his mother had built with her own hands on land she had filed for in a government office with red dust on her hem and her whole inheritance in a leather satchel, while the man who became his father stood behind her in line and said, 'I'll back that.' The years that followed had the quality of things that are built rather than found, not the dramatic rupture of the land run, but the steady, accumulating work of days and seasons that add up to a life. The Redmond Doyle operation grew. The cattle herd reached 80 head by 1893, and Patrick leased 40 acres of additional grazing from a neighbor who had failed to keep his claim and sold out. The wheat became a reliable crop on Gertrude's land, and she added oats in 1892 on the recommendation of James Running Fox, who had family further south who grew them. The kitchen garden market sales had become a genuine business. Gertrude was supplying 3 restaurants in Guthrie by 1893, and she had hired a young woman named Ada Marsh, a recent widow whose husband had been killed in a thrashing accident, to help with the canning and the market transport. Combe grew. He was, from the beginning, a child of tremendous stubborn energy, which surprised no one. He walked early, talked early, had opinions about everything, and followed James Running Fox around the corral with the devoted attention of a small dog, trying to learn about horses with a seriousness that seemed outsized for a 2-year-old and became perfectly appropriate for a 3-year-old. In the spring of 1893, Gertrude told Patrick she was expecting again. "Again you sat with it for a day before telling me," he said. "I was organizing my thoughts," she said. "I know," he said. "I waited." "You always wait," she said. "It's worth it," he said. Their daughter arrived in November of 1893, Margaret, after Patrick's mother, with red hair that shaded toward copper in the sunlight, and a temperament that was decisive and sunny, and almost nothing like either of her parents, which seemed to them both a splendid thing. She arrived faster than Combe had, with less drama and considerably more efficiency, as if she had assessed the situation and decided the fastest route to the world was the best one. Ingrid Sorensen, who was now a reliable fixture in any medical situation within 5 miles, said she had never attended an easier birth and congratulated Gertrude on her continued practicality. By 1895, the Redmond Doyle operation was one of the most productive small-scale operations in the Guthrie area. The original 320 acres, 160 under each name, had been joined by the leased grazing and a purchased 40-acre parcel to the east, the former Sorensen claim, because Eric Sorensen had decided to return to Minnesota and had sold it to them at a fair price with genuine affection and a handshake that had lasted a full 30 seconds. James Running Fox was now the foreman of the cattle operation, with a permanent wages agreement that Patrick and Gertrude had written up with Morris the attorney, and which included a profit-sharing arrangement that was, in 1895, still unusual enough in the territory to generate comment. James managed it with his characteristic flat practicality. He also, in 1894, married a Chickasaw woman named Louisa, and they built a house on the northwest corner of the Redmond property, which was fine with Patrick and Gertrude, and was the kind of thing that people either understood or did not. And the ones who did not understand it were not the kind of people either of them much valued. In the fall of 1895, Homer Blatch attempted one final piece of trouble. He had been quietly present in the county for 6 years, expanding his land holdings through a series of purchases that were aggressive and methodical, and building something that was less a farm and more a land accumulation enterprise. He had never again directly interfered with Gertrude's claim, following Judge Carr's warning with the obedience of a man who understood legal consequences perfectly well, but he had made offers to buy out her claim twice, once in 1891 and once in 1893, and both times she had declined without extensive explanation. In September 1895, he bought the claim to the southeast of Gertrude's land and began construction of a windmill and water tower that, by a careful engineering coincidence, would redirect the subsurface drainage and potentially affect the water table feeding Gertrude's well. Patrick discovered this when he was talking to the county engineer about a drainage question on the northern property, and the engineer mentioned the Blatch windmill application with the neutral tone of a man who did not want to be involved in whatever was coming. He came home and told Gertrude. She sat at the kitchen table, which was the same table they had built together in the winter of 1889 from salvage lumber, now worn smooth with 6 years of use, and she looked at the problem with the same flat, assessing intelligence she had always brought to obstacles. "Who is the county engineer?" she asked. "A man named Pritchard," Patrick said. "Is he the same one who approved the Blatch windmill application?" "Yes." "Then I need to speak with him," she said. "Not to block the windmill. Blatch has a legal right to develop his own property. But I need to have on record that the county is responsible for monitoring the downstream hydrological effects of any large-scale water infrastructure development, and I need that in writing before the windmill is built." Patrick looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for exactly as long as I was talking," he said. "I was listening and thinking simultaneously," she said. "I've had practice." She went to see Pritchard the following Tuesday. She brought the original survey of her well, the county filing records, and a 3-page written argument she had composed herself, which was careful and specific, and cited the Territorial Land Act of 1889 in 2 places. Pritchard was a methodical man who was made visibly uncomfortable by the fact that Gertrude Doyle Redmond was considerably more familiar with the relevant statutes than he was, but he was not a dishonest man, and he read every page she put in front of him. He issued a hydrogeological monitoring requirement for the Blatch windmill project. The requirement meant that before full operation, Blatch would need to demonstrate that the windmill's water extraction rate would not materially affect neighboring water tables. This would take 6 months of measurement. Homer Blatch's lawyer filed an objection. Pritchard upheld the requirement. The objection went to the territorial court. Judge Carr, the same Judge Carr, read the monitoring requirement in Gertrude's original document and said that the requirement was consistent with existing territorial regulations regarding shared subsurface resources. Blatch withdrew the objection. The windmill was built the following spring. The monitoring showed a minimal effect on the Doyle well, just enough that Pritchard required Blatch to install a limiting valve on his extraction rate, which Blatch accepted with the gracefulness of a man who has run out of options. He sold his southeast claim to a different buyer 2 years later and moved his land operation north of Guthrie, which was the last they ever heard of him. Gertrude stood at the edge of her southern boundary and looked at the new windmill on the former Blatch property, turning slowly in the October wind, belonging now to a young family named Decker who had 2 small children and a disposition toward neighborliness, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been contested and held. "That's the last of it," she said. Patrick stood beside her, comb on his shoulders. The boy was 5 and had decided that the best view of anything was from his father's shoulders, and Margaret at his side, holding his hand with the decisive grip of a 2-year-old who does not intend to let go. "The last of it," he agreed. She looked at her land. 160 acres, plus the shared operations of the northern claim and the eastern parcel. The house she had built and expanded twice. The well that Patrick had helped locate on her second full day here. The garden that had fed them and paid for glass jars and hired Ada Marsh and bought a second horse. The wheat field that rippled in the wind every summer like something breathing. The kitchen that smelled of dried herbs and coffee and whatever she was canning this week. She had done exactly what she said she was going to do. The years between 1895 and the turn of the century were the ones that built the bone structure of everything. Combe grew into the kind of boy who was happiest outdoors and learned to ride almost before he could run, spending half his hours with James running fox and acquiring a knowledge of cattle and horses that was considerably more sophisticated than what most children acquired before the age of 10. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's green eyes, and the combination produced a face that was, at 6, just beginning to arrange itself into its permanent expression, which appeared to be one of interested, practical attention to whatever was in front of him. He reminded Patrick of Gertrude so often that he sometimes had to look away from the boy to compose himself. Margaret grew into a person of extraordinary energy and sociability, who was by the age of 4 deeply embedded in the community life of the surrounding claims in a way that suggested she would run something important one day and enjoy doing it tremendously. She charmed Ingrid Sorensen and Ada Marsh and Louisa, running Fox with equal and impartial warmth, and she had opinions about the color of the house shutters and the arrangement of the garden beds that were frankly more articulate than most adults' opinions about anything. In 1897, Gertrude was elected to the Guthrie Township School Board, which had been formed 3 years earlier to manage the development of proper schooling in the district. She had not sought the position. It had been proposed by Ingrid Sorensen at a community meeting and seconded by Ada Marsh before Gertrude had fully understood what was happening, and she had accepted because the alternative was to watch someone less qualified make important decisions about children's education. She served for 4 years. She helped establish the first brick schoolhouse in the district, negotiated the salary of the first permanent teacher from an embarrassing figure to something a qualified person would actually accept, and instituted a policy that children of all backgrounds in the district were entitled to attend, which included several Chickasaw children from the families of men who worked the surrounding properties, and which Gertrude enforced with the same flat and absolute directness she brought to everything. Patrick supported this completely and kept the cattle operation expanding and the North Claim productive, and was, in every way that mattered, a man who had meant what he said about building two things side by side. At Christmas time in 1899, on the last evening of the century, they sat on the porch of the expanded house. It had 3 rooms now, and the sleeping loft, and a covered porch on the east side that Gertrude had insisted upon because she wanted to watch the mornings and looked out over the land in the winter dark. Combe was 9 and had fallen asleep in his chair. Margaret was 6 and was still awake by sheer determination, sitting on Patrick's lap with her copper head against his chest, watching the darkness with the bright eyes of someone waiting for something wonderful to appear. The cattle were quiet in the corral. James and Louis's light was on to the northwest. Drummer had died 2 years ago, peacefully and in advanced old age, and there was a new gray gelding named Drummer 2 by Combe, without much creativity, in the paddock beside Agnes, who was also getting old now but was still going with the philosophical endurance of a horse that has always been practical. "Do you know what the next century will look like?" Margaret said. "Nobody does," Patrick said. "I think there will be more people," she said with confidence. "I think you're right," he said. "And more houses," she said, "probably. And better schools," she said with a pointed look at her mother. "Definitely better schools," Gertrude said. Gertrude looked out at the dark prairie. January 1890, she had sat in a tent through a wind that lasted 2 weeks. That was 10 years ago, and the distance between that tent and this porch was built entirely out of work and patience, and the particular courage of deciding to do a thing and then doing it, and out of a man who had stood behind her in a line and said 3 words. She looked at Patrick. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know completely, the quiet, steady attention of a man who finds the person he loves genuinely interesting, always without exception. 10 years of that look, and it had not diminished or become routine. If anything, it had become more itself, more fully what it was, the way things that are real tend to do when given time. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The Land Office," she said. He smiled. The real one, the full and open one that his face did not produce frequently but meant completely. "Gerald stamped those documents," he said. "He did," she said. "And you backed that." "I would have been an idiot not to," he said. She laughed softly, and Margaret looked between them with the assessing curiosity of a child who knows she is missing something, but has decided it is probably fine. Combe stirred in his chair and did not wake up. The century turned at midnight. Somewhere in Guthrie, there were bells and voices, and the sound of people celebrating the arrival of something new. And on the porch of the house that Gertrude had built on the land she had filed for a loan, in the territory that had cracked open in a single extraordinary afternoon 11 years ago, and poured 100,000 people across a starting line. Patrick Redmond and Gertrude Doyle Redmond sat in the winter dark and listened to the bells, and held their sleeping children and held each other. And the land ran away from them in every direction, patient and permanent and entirely theirs. 3 weeks into the new century, in the particular quiet of a late January afternoon, when Combe was at school, and Margaret was at Louisa Running Fox's house, learning something from Louisa that Gertrude was not yet sure about but trusted Louisa to make educational, Gertrude walked out to the southern boundary of her claim and stood at the corner stake. The stake was iron, as it had always been. She had replaced the original one twice, once after Blatch pulled it, once after a spring flood shifted the stone cairn, and this was the third one, hammered into the Oklahoma red soil with her own hands last spring, when she had been checking the boundary markers after the Decker family moved into the South. She crouched and put her hand on it. 160 acres. Her name in the registration ledger at the Guthrie Land Office, stamped in April 1889 by a tired young clerk who had done his job properly, and thereby been part of something that mattered. A well at 7 feet and 2 inches, 8 feet west of the original dig site, full of clean, cold water. A house with an east-facing door, a porch that caught the morning light, a kitchen garden that produced enough to feed a family and supply 3 Guthrie restaurants, a wheat field that exhaled gold every July, her father's land, her land. She heard hoofbeats behind her and turned. Patrick was coming south on Drummer 2 at an easy trot, and he pulled up 10 feet from her and looked at her crouching at the stake with his permanent expression of interested attention. "Everything all right," he said. "Everything is exactly right," she said. She stood up, dusting the red soil from her hands on the front of her skirt, and walked back to where he was, and he extended his hand, and she took it, not because she needed help, but because she wanted to, which was, she had long decided, the best possible reason to take anything from anyone. He pulled her up easily, and she settled onto Agnes behind him for a moment. They had done this 100 times. The horse was entirely unfazed, and they looked south over the boundary together, at the Decker windmill turning slowly in the January air, at the flat Oklahoma land running away to the horizon under the pale winter sky. "The Deckers are going to plant corn this spring," Patrick said. "Their eldest asked me about the soil in the southeast corner. It's good soil in the southeast corner," Gertrude said. "I'll tell them about the drainage pattern." "I figured you would," he said. They turned north, toward home, and rode back across the claim that was hers and the claim that was his and the life they had built on both of them, side by side, exactly as they had planned, with the cattle moving in the north corral and James Running Fox's smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney and the kitchen garden lying dormant under the January cold, waiting with its patient vegetable intelligence for the spring. The house was warm when they got back, because they had left the kitchen fire banked, and it came back quickly when Gertrude opened the damper and added 2 pieces of the split oak that was stacked under the porch overhang. She put the kettle on. Patrick unsaddled the horses and turned them into the paddock and came in through the back door, knocking the mud from his boots on the step, and sat down at the kitchen table, the salvage lumber table, 6 years older than Combe, worn smooth and solid and completely reliable, and watched her move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who owns every inch of the space they occupy. "You know," he said, "I have thought approximately every day about that morning in the land office." She looked at him over her shoulder. "What about it?" "I had been in line for 40 minutes, he said. "I was tired and I had dust in my eyes and I had not eaten anything since the night before. And then you came through that door and the whole room shifted and I thought, I have no idea who that woman is, but she knows exactly what she is doing, and she is going to do it regardless of every obstacle in this building." Gertrude turned from the stove. "And then Blatch tried to push in front of me." "And then Blatch tried to push in front of you," Patrick said. "And I thought, no. Absolutely not. 3 words," she said. "They were the right 3, he said." She brought the coffee to the table and sat across from him, and they were quiet together in the warm kitchen with the wind beginning outside and the kettle starting its low complaint before the boil. And Gertrude Doyle Redmond thought about the particular shape of a life. The way it is made of 1,000 small decisions, most of them made in ordinary moments, in lines, and at creek banks and at kitchen tables. Decisions that look small from the outside and turn out, from the inside, to have been everything. She had walked into a land office alone to file a claim for 160 acres on the Oklahoma Territory prairie, and she had done it with calloused hands and $40, and a satchel that held her father's dream and her own iron determination. And the man behind her in line had said, "I'll back that." And here they were. A house, a well, a field of wheat, a kitchen garden, 44 head of cattle and growing, 2 children who were the best argument she had ever seen for the future, a foreman who was honest and skilled and fairly paid, and a husband who had never once asked her to become less than she was. She looked at Patrick across the table, and he looked back at her, and the kettle began to whistle. She got up to pour the water, and he turned to watch her, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Oklahoma winter turned the land to silver and waited, as it always did, for spring. In February of 1900, Gertrude discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She sat with it for half a day this time. She was getting faster and told Patrick over supper. He looked at her across the table. "Are you pleased?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. "Good," he said. "So am I." Combe, when told, said he hoped for a brother because 2 sisters seemed like a lot. Margaret, when told, said she hoped for a sister because she had plans for her, and she had already given the plans considerable thought. Gertrude told them both that the baby would be whoever it chose to be, and they would manage. The spring of 1900 brought the best wheat-growing season Gertrude had seen since she began planting. The winter wheat was deep green in February, and by June it was a pale gold sea that stretched from the house to the southern boundary, and the yield, when they cut and threshed it, was the largest they had ever had. She took 3 wagon loads to the grain elevator and came home with a check that was more than twice anything she had earned in a single harvest. She put a portion of it in the bank. She used another portion to buy a proper mechanical cream separator for the kitchen, because she had been making butter by hand for 10 years and her right arm had decided it was done. She used the remainder to purchase 25 additional fruit tree starts from a nursery in Kansas City, apple and pear, and 1 plum, which she planted in the northwest corner of her claim in a neat orchard that would not yield for 3 or 4 years but would, when it did, produce something that would last beyond her. An orchard. She had always wanted an orchard. Her 3rd child arrived in October 1900, attended again by Ingrid Sorensen, who had now become so integrated into the life of the Redmond Doyle household that she arrived with her own bag and a proprietary air. It was another boy, dark-haired like Combe, with the beginning of what looked like Patrick's jaw, and he arrived in the world with a practicality that Ingrid said reminded her strongly of his mother, which everyone in the room considered an excellent sign. They named him Finn, which had been Gertrude's maternal grandfather's name, and which had a clean and useful sound to it that she had always liked. Finn Redmond, who would grow up between the cattle operation to the north and the wheat fields to the south and would have, before he was 5, strong opinions about irrigation. The orchard grew. The cattle herd reached 112 head by 1902. The kitchen garden expanded to fill a 1/4 acre and required a full-time hand, and Ada Marsh's daughter Clara joined the operation at 16, learning the canning and the market and the record-keeping with an aptitude that made Gertrude feel something that was very close to what she imagined a teacher felt when they watched a student surpass them. Combe, at 11, could ride anything in the paddock and had started learning the business of cattle management from James running Fox with the focused seriousness of someone who had already decided what he was going to do with his life. Patrick watched this with the complicated pride of a father who recognizes himself and someone better than himself simultaneously. Margaret, at 8, was in school 4 days a week and at the market with her mother on Saturdays and was already proposing improvements to the garden layout that were frankly quite good, and which Gertrude implemented with only enough delay to allow for the dignity of her own authority. Finn, at 2, was deeply committed to the existential exploration of mud. On a warm October evening in 1902, 12 years after the house was built and 13 years after the land run that had started it all, Gertrude and Patrick sat on the east porch in the early dark and listened to the sounds of the operation settling around them, cattle quiet in the north, horses in the paddock, the creek murmuring somewhere in the lower field, the distant sound of Combe playing something tuneless on a harmonica in his room with what Gertrude generously described as enthusiasm. The fruit trees in the northwest corner were loaded this year, the apples especially, a bright red variety that she had chosen from the catalog with care, which had proven everything the catalog claimed and more. "We should can the rest of the apples tomorrow," she said. "Clara could do it," Patrick said. "Clara and I will do it together," Gertrude said. "It goes faster with two." He smiled. He had always found her unwillingness to step back from the physical work of the operation genuinely charming rather than stubbornly excessive, because he understood that the work itself was part of what she loved, not a burden she had not yet been able to put down. "That's a lot of apple butter," he said. "The Guthrie market will take all of it," she said. "And I told the proprietor at Hendrick's restaurant that we'd have it by mid-October." "Then we'd better get it done," he said. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the dark sky over the Oklahoma Territory, which was enormous and clear and full of stars in the way that a sky can only be when you are far enough from everything that nothing interrupts it. The Big Dipper was directly overhead and the Milky Way was a soft, dense band from south to north. 13 years, she said. "From that morning in the land office," he said. "Yes." "I did not expect to be here when I walked through that door," she said. "I expected the claim, I expected the house. I expected the wheat and the garden and the fight with Blatch." She paused. "I did not expect you." "I did not expect you either," he said. "I expected 160 acres and a great deal of work. I got those." "You got a great deal of work," she agreed. "I got considerably more than that," he said. She reached across the small distance between their chairs and took his hand, which was rough and strong and warm, and he folded his fingers around hers with the easy permanence of someone performing a gesture so familiar it has become instinct. The land ran out from them in every direction under the stars, the north claim and the south claim, the wheat field and the kitchen garden and the orchard, the cattle operation and the leased grazing and the brick schoolhouse that her school board work had made real, and the 3 children sleeping in the house behind them, and the grave that held nothing but a dream that had been dreamed about this land by a man named Gertrude Doyle who had read government pamphlets at a kitchen table in Missouri and loved his daughter enough to want her to have something no one could take away. She had it. She was sitting on it. She held Patrick's hand in the October dark and was entirely at peace with everything she had done and everything she was, which was the rarest and most complete form of happiness she had ever discovered. The kind that is not an event or a moment but a condition, built slowly, out of work and honesty and love and the courage to walk into a land office alone and say, "This is mine, I have the documents, I intend to file." And the extraordinary, irreplaceable good fortune of hearing, from the man behind her in line, "I'll back that." The apple butter was put up the next day, 34 jars of it, labeled in Gertrude's clear handwriting and stored on the kitchen shelves that lined the east wall of the expanded house, the wall that faced the morning light. exactly as she had planned when she first drew the house in her notebook in the spring of 1889. The jars caught the afternoon light and glowed red gold, 34 small suns on a shelf in a house on the Oklahoma prairie, and everything was exactly as it should be. The Redmond Doyle operation continued to grow, steadily and without drama, the way things grow when they are tended by people who understand patience. By the time Combe was 20, he had taken over the day-to-day management of the cattle operation alongside James running Fox, and Patrick had stepped back to the larger strategy, the leasing decisions, the market relationships, the conversations with the Guthrie Bank about credit lines for herd expansion. It was a smooth transition, the kind that happens when the person taking over has been trained since they could walk by someone who understood that the best inheritance is competence, not just land. Margaret, at 17, was the sharpest mind at the Guthrie District School, and she told her parents with characteristic directness the spring of 1910 that she intended to attend the newly established university in Norman, where she would study something useful, and that she expected their support. They gave it immediately and completely, and she went in September 1910 with a trunk of sensible clothes and enough money for the first year and a list of practical considerations that she had written herself, and that her mother reviewed and added 2 items to. She came home for Christmas and told them she was studying law. Patrick and Gertrude sat with this information at the kitchen table. "Good," Gertrude said. "She'll be extraordinary at it," Patrick said. "Undoubtedly," Gertrude said. Finn, at 10, had the irrigation opinions that had been predicted by his general temperament, and was already persuading his father to let him experiment with a small diversion channel from the creek to the farthest corner of the wheat field, which Patrick authorized with the specific confidence of a man who had long since learned that you let people who know what they are doing do what they know. On the day that Gerald Finch retired from the Guthrie Land Office, it was 1912, and Gerald was 51 and had decided to move back to Indiana to be near his sister. Gertrude rode into Guthrie for the small farewell gathering that a few long-time residents had organized. She brought a jar of apple butter and a jar of pickled vegetables because she always did, and she shook Gerald's hand and thanked him with a specificity that clearly moved him for the stamp he had put on a document on an April morning in 1889. "You would have filed it regardless," Gerald said. "You had everything in order." "Yes," she said. "But there were men in that room who would have made it more complicated than it needed to be if certain things had gone differently." Gerald smiled. He was older now, with gray at the temples and the permanently slightly exhausted look of a man who had spent 23 years being the first government face that 50,000 desperate people had ever seen. "Redmond," he said. "He made a good case." 3 words, Gertrude said. Gerald laughed. "I remember it perfectly," he said. "I'll back that." "I thought that's either a very foolish man or a very good one." "Which did it turn out to be?" she said. "A very good one," Gerald said. "Obviously." She drove home in the afternoon light, the wagon rolling easy over the road that was now properly graded. Guthrie had become a real city, with electric lights and a telephone exchange and 3 newspapers, and the Oklahoma prairie stretching away on both sides of the road, all the way to the horizon. The land that had been empty grassland 23 years ago when the gun fired, and 50,000 horses raced across a starting line, was now marked in every direction with the signs of the life that had been built here: farmhouses and barns and windmills and fence lines and orchards and fields of wheat and corn, and the occasional water tower catching the afternoon light. She drove through the gate of the Redmond Doyle operation and up the path to the house and tied the wagon horse to the post, and Patrick came out the back door and took the horse's bridle and looked at her with the expression that was still, 23 years on, the one her face returned to, the specific warmth of being looked at by someone who knows you entirely and is still interested. "How was Gerald?" he said. "Well," she said. "Glad to be going. He sent his regards." "Good man," Patrick said. "The best kind," she said. She climbed down from the wagon and they walked into the house together, through the back door, into the kitchen that smelled of the coffee that was always on, and the dried herbs on the ceiling, and the apple butter on the shelf, and the bread that was rising in a bowl by the stove, and the particular combination of those things that had no name except home. The sun came in through the east-facing windows and lay across the floor in long gold rectangles, and the land ran out from every side of the house, patient and permanent and entirely theirs. And Gertrude Doyle Redmond, who had walked into a land office alone and filed for 160 acres, and changed her life with $40 and a leather satchel and the absolute refusal to be told no, stood in her kitchen in the October light and knew herself to be, completely and without qualification, exactly where she had chosen to be, which was, in the end, the only kind of happiness worth having,